Today I'm really excited to talk to you about the truth about adrenal fatigue and what your doctors will not tell you about adrenal fatigue. So let's paint a picture first. You're exhausted, you're burnt out, you don't handle stress very well, you crash in the middle of the day, you don't have energy to get through the day, you don't fall asleep, you don't stay asleep, you don't wake up feeling refreshed, you have potentially anxiety, you feel like you're in sympathetic fight or flight, you don't have exercise energy to be able to bounce back the same way that you used to. Perhaps you have hormonal imbalance, perhaps you're not able to lose weight, your libido, your motivation, your drive, it's not there, right? These are all the things that you're potentially dealing with, and you're exhausted and you're burnt out and you're looking for solutions. So then you go to the doctor and you're doing this research on your own and you find out that there's this thing called adrenal fatigue, and the doctors don't believe that it's a real thing. This is something that I've dealt with on my own. I've suffered with my own adrenal fatigue problem, my own adrenal fatigue nightmare, and I had to go back and do the research for myself to figure out, A, what is this? B, why is it not being accepted? C, what can I do about it? And D, how do I teach other people what to do about it for themselves? So that's what you're watching right now. And what I want to talk to you about today is what doctors will not tell you about your adrenal fatigue problem. So first and foremost, let's talk about the new term called the HPA axis dysfunction. So you have your hypothalamus, it signals to your pituitary, which signal to your adrenals to make cortisol. And then ultimately cortisol feeds forward and typically comes back to the hypothalamus and tells the brain, hey, we got enough of this going on, we don't need any more, and it turns off. That's ideal. But what happens over time based on stressors, environmental chemicals and cues, pesticides and sprays, EMFs, poor nutritional habits, you name it, 2020 basically, all of these additional stressors will continue to cause this loop to continue to feed forward. And as a result, you'll be depleted, you won't have energy, you won't have your nutrients, you won't handle stress very well, and you'll have all the things that we just finished talking about. Hopefully that made a lot of sense. So what I wanted to talk to you about is what doctors will not tell you about adrenal fatigue. Because ultimately what they do is they say, well, let's pretend, let's knock on the adrenal's door to see if anyone's coming and anyone's answering the bell. And that is called an ACTH stimulation test. So basically the pituitary, it makes a bunch of different hormones that signal your glands to make and mount a response, neuroendocrine response, so that you can communicate and you could deal with that stressor. And ultimately the pituitary makes something called ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal glands to produce its glucocorticoids, its mineralocorticoids. I tell people, think about the three main things that it tells the adrenals to do is make energy, balance your fluid levels, reduce inflammation. Those are the main three things. So those are things that are called upon your body, make energy, deal with inflammation, and balance your minerals on a moment-to-moment, day-by-day basis, all of the time, over and over and over again. So what the reductionistic traditional allopathic approach will do is they'll test the adrenals and they'll say, hey, they're not fatigued. When we send a pituitary signal, we'll give you ACTH, and we'll see if those adrenals mount a minimum effective response, or not even effective, a minimum response. And if it's not lower than that minimum response, then you're told that you don't have this thing called adrenal fatigue. So there's a lot of assumptions in that. Number one, it doesn't happen very often where someone is lower than that amount. And if it is a known autoimmunity called Addison's disease. Or if you're above that amount, it's called Cushing's disease. And that's where adrenal insufficiency, when you talk to a medical doctor, that's what they're hearing. That's what they're interpreting. And if it's not lower than that response, then there's no such thing as an adrenal fatigue. They'll call it an HPA axis dysfunction, but it's more than that. It's just so much more than that. There's a couple other faults in that as well, is that the amount of ACTH hormone that they give you is pretty assumptuous in terms of that's how much you're producing on a daily basis, which you really aren't, which they're not testing. And there's so many other things that can go wrong, which I'll teach you today in terms of feedback loops, making the available hormone, breaking it down, getting into the cell, having receptors to bind to, and all of these other protective mechanisms that your body does to protect this from breaking the body down too much, where you may do a adrenal test or an ACTH test and find that the cortisol levels are fine or not below that minimum amount, but yet that person is exhausted, tired, can't handle stress, crashes in the middle of the day, heart palpitations, anxiety, brain fog, not waking up feeling refreshed, and they're not being listened to, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they're not being listened to. So that paints the picture first and foremost in terms of what an adrenal-based problem from an allopathic approach is looked at. It's looked at. But what I wanted to tell you today is doctors will not tell you this. And what it has to do is I'm going to take this away and I'm going to circle this right here and see if I can circle it for you guys and talk at the same time. If I can, then I have this whole new skill set of talking and chewing gum at the same time. So what I circled was mast cells. Mast cells. And you probably heard me talk about this in the past, but mast cells are your immune system. It's your white blood cells. And if you notice, it's actually stimulating the hypothalamus. And stimulating the hypothalamus. That's really important to know because anyone who's dealing with mast cells that are being activated are activating your HPA axis, first and foremost. So I want you to understand that. Now what I want to do is I want to go down and explain a little bit more about what mast cells do. So if you're involved in an environment like we live in today's day and age, which you are because you're watching this, you have so many environmental cues that are programmed to stimulate your mast cells. Unfortunately, with advancement of technology, we have major EMFs that stimulate those mast cells. So ultimately, EMFs stimulate your cortisol production, right? Because if we think about mast cells stimulate the hypothalamus, then anything that stimulates the mast cells are going to stimulate the hypothalamus. And there's a lot of things. There's EMFs, there's mold, there's xenobiotics, pesticides, sprays, estrogen stuff, plastics. I mean, they're all in the waters nowadays, and you don't need me to argue. You can just go to PubMed and find out that that's actually the case. But then there's also other things like allergens and diesel and exhaust and smoking particulates. And these are things that are in the world, unfortunately, on the West Coast with California and the pesticides, or even just the exhaust and the forest fires and the petroleums. There's just so many things that stimulate your mast cells. And I'll tell you nowadays, what your doctor won't tell you is if you are dealing with an HPA axis dysfunction, or you want to go as far as an adrenal fatigue based problem, you have an overactivation of your mast cells. You simply do. And what I tell people is you have too many on-ramps to your mast cell highway. And if we can identify these on-ramps, one being stress, one being EMFs, one being mold, one being histamines, one being oxalates, one being dopamine. And dopamine is a huge part of it. Just think about the addiction of notifications. When I get notified that I have a text, or I have a comment, or I have a like, or I have an email, or I have a missed call, or I have whatever, that dopamine hit is becoming addictive, right? I mean, we're so addicted to our phones. If you didn't have your phone and you lost it, you'd be sort of wondering, where is it? Why do I not have it? That dopamine that is constantly elevated and overproduced, especially with caffeines and stimulants and nicotine, and needing that bolt of energy to get you going, that stimulates your mast cells too in way of dopamine, which is down here. So you have all of these things that stimulate these mast cells if you live in the world that we live in today, which is normal. It is normal. I mean, not at the absolute amount of thresholds that we get exposed to in terms of information on a day-to-day basis, but it's normal in terms of our body is engineered to deal with these stressors and communicating signalers and chemical mediators and inflammatory messengers to tell your body how to maintain homeostasis, right? Because that's what the stress response system does, is it maintains a homeostasis. But when it loses its ability to maintain homeostasis, that's where you have this permanent fatigue, this permanent brain fog, this not handling stress well. And if you do an ACTH stimulation test, many times it's going to be negative because your body is actually way more mast cell activated than it should be, and it's producing a lot of cortisol, and you're not showing a negative test, but there's a lot of other breakdowns in mechanics in other places. Does that make sense? So what I like to explain to people, because I just had a client that we looked at this today. So they have excess histamine production. At the end of the day, all of these things that go on the on-ramp to the mast cell highway end up going downstream to the histamine highway. And histamine is very excitatory. It's an important neurotransmitter to mount an allergic response, but we have non-classical histamine symptoms, and that could be anxiety, GI disturbances, brain fog, joint pains, insomnia, not handling stressors very well. All the same very reasons you would be looking out to talk to me, even though you may say, well, I don't have allergies, Joel. I don't feel like I'm allergic to things, or I get runny or teary or redness or swelling. I don't get any of that. And I'm like, well, why are you and I talking? Well, because I'm exhausted, I'm burnt out, I have no libido, I can't lose weight. Well, guess what? You have cars on your histamine highway also. And here's the relationship that I want to show you over here. So if we make this a little bit bigger, we can see cortisol. When histamine is released, cortisol is produced to satisfy histamine. So if you're having all this excess histamine production because of genetic susceptibilities, environmental chemicals and toxins, too much cars getting on the highway, not enough cars getting off the highway, you're gonna have downstream impacts on your cortisol. Hopefully that makes sense. And you're not gonna test that on an ACTH stimulation test. You just aren't. And what you're gonna deal with is you're going to be dealing with a whole slew of mitochondrial-based problems. And when I say mitochondrial-based problems, the ability of your cells, your tissues, your organs, your systems, everything to work together to produce ATP, to function, to be able to maintain homeostasis. And when it loses its ability to do that, then all bets are off. And what I've seen is POTS disease or POTS syndrome, where autonomic dysfunction, you can't regulate your blood pressure, you can't regulate your temperature, you can't regulate your respiratory function, your pulse, you stand up, you get lightheaded and you have tachycardia, you have all these things. It's because you've losing the battle of supply and demand. And you're not even regulating the autonomic nervous system at this point. Really, really important for you to do. So what I suggest to people is, it's a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift. You have an adrenal-based problem, which is an HPA axis dysfunction, which is an overactivation of your mast cells. It's an underclearance of your histamine. It's an inability to meet supply and demand. And ultimately, your body is prioritizing what it can and can't do. And you are left with frustration, not knowing where to start, having your laundry list of supplements in terms of your little pharmacy that you're making, spending thousands of dollars, and really not moving the needle, and being super frustrated because doctors aren't asking you about your diet or your lifestyle. Doctors don't really care to know and investigate further your history, when you had your traumas, your environmental cues, all of the puzzle pieces that need to be together, because you need to understand, hey, for Susie, you have these 3 on-ramps, you have these 2 off-ramps that we need to open and close, and we need to figure out how to balance all of them together so it fits in with your lifestyle so that you can see the needle move. I mean, that's really, really important. So I want to start to spend time answering questions for you guys and making sure that you understand what is really the truth about adrenal fatigue and what can you do about it. The mast cells are very real. They sit on the HPA axis and they create a supply and demand problem. And then the testing that you do, and more importantly, the supplements that you take and the nutritional protocols and strategies that you employ to get better don't work. Because, pardon me, you're throwing crap at the wall to see what sticks. At the end of the day, that's what you're doing. So my goal is to educate you. I want you to ask questions. I want you to post your comments. I want you to invite your friends, start a thread. I will be more active in this Facebook group so that I can help you get your health back. And I'm always available to do a no obligation consultation to troubleshoot what are your major on-ramps, what are your major off-ramps that aren't working effectively, how's it impacting you, what's missing, what do you need to be doing, what could you be doing, where do you want to be going, and how to reverse engineer that. Taken from someone who's been exhausted and burnt out on their own, who's been frustrated, who hasn't been believed, who has just been thrown medication or reductionistic approaches of going for counseling or just trying to relax or being more disciplined with your diet. All of the above, I've heard those things, and it's very frustrating when that's the advice that you're getting. I will post a link to my schedule to be able to schedule a no charge, no obligation 45-minute consultation. That is for us to troubleshoot. So don't send me your labs, don't send me your blood tests, don't send me your raw data. What it's about is figuring out, where are you now? What have you tried? What's helped? What hasn't helped? What's not working? How much is it impacting you? Where would you be if you didn't have this? And what's missing for you to get this? And if I feel like I can help you, I'll tell you the exact steps that you need to do to get there, whether we work together or not. And if we decide that we're a good fit, I'll tell you exactly how that works too. But that's not the point of the call. The point of the call is for you to get really clear on the truth of your health challenge, what's not happening that should be happening, what needs to happen so that you can get your health back, and what it's going to look like for you to do that. That's the goal. But don't be just kicking the tires if you're not serious about getting your health back. So I hope that's helpful for you. I'll be going through this post to look at your questions and your comments and your suggestions, and I look forward to helping you end your adrenal fatigue nightmare. Take care.